संसद टीवी के और भी प्रोग्राम्स देखने के लिए सब्सक्राइब करें हमारा यूट्यूब चैनल और हाँ, इन्हें लाइक और शेयर करना ना भूलें।
Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. Prime Minister Narendra Modi participated in the 16th BRICS Summit held under Russia's chairship in Kazan. At the summit, the BRICS leaders had productive discussions on strengthening multilateralism, countering terrorism, fostering economic growth, pursuing sustainable development, and bringing spotlight on the concerns of the Global South. The leaders also welcomed the 13 new BRICS partner countries. Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed 2 sessions of the BRICS Summit. He spoke about the world undergoing several uncertainties and challenges, including conflicts, adverse climate impacts, and cyber threats, which he said has now placed greater expectations upon the BRICS. For this, the Prime Minister suggested that the group take a people-centric approach to tackle these challenges. Also, on the sidelines of the summit, the Prime Minister held bilateral meetings with various leaders, including Chinese President Xi Jinping. This was their first structured bilateral meeting at a delegation level in nearly 5 years, the last one being on the sidelines of the BRICS Summit in Brasilia in 2019. So on the show today, we are going to talk about the outcomes of this crucial meeting, also the significant takeaways from the 16th BRICS Summit. 2 distinguished guests join me on the broadcast to share their perspective. I'm pleased to welcome in the studio Professor Swaran Singh, Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program. Joining us virtually is former Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri. Ambassador, delighted to have you with us on the broadcast as well. The Prime Minister's visit to Russia, Professor, from the perspective of both the bilateral engagements that he had and also his participation in the BRICS Summit has been quite significant. We'll talk about the BRICS engagement first. In line with India's policy of multilateralism, trying to seek greater voice and greater participation of the countries of the Global South, how important has the 16th BRICS Summit been?
Thank you. I think India has been a votary of multilateralism from the very beginning, and it appears that BRICS on international stage is the most thriving multilateral arrangement that we see. This is particularly seen from the number of aspirant nations. So in the last summit meeting in Johannesburg, President Ramaphosa had said 43 nations had expressed intention to join and 19 had formally applied, out of which certain countries were offered membership. This time in Kazan, again 34 nations had expressed a desire to join, particularly some of the very interesting names like Turkey, which is a NATO member, is willing to join BRICS nations. Even among ASEAN nations, which is supposed to be close to Western nations, countries like Thailand, Malaysia are thinking to join BRICS nations. So the most exciting multilateral grouping, as I call it, it's not an organization, in which India is seen as a very central player, partly because of the whole rising stature of India in terms of going to be 3rd largest economy, the personal aura of Indian Prime Minister and his style of building personal relationships. And in that sense, particularly the fact that they were able to build consensus on bringing in 13 new partners, because that excitement has to stay on. Otherwise, we were talking of the pause put on membership in the last foreign ministers meeting of BRICS nations. There was a little uncertainty what happens to aspirant nations. So they found a formula to get new nations on board. They've been particularly emphatic on issues of Global South being represented in global governance. On climate change, for example, they've been very emphatic on climate finance. I think it's also interesting that the meeting took place just before the G20 summit is going to happen. So some of these issues are going to be also pressed upon in G20 meeting, which is where BRICS always sits as a mini summit within the G20 summit meeting. Very quickly for India, there are multiple levels of looking at what India was doing in terms of bilateral relationships. The meeting with the Iranian president was interesting because he just taken over.
Sure, we'll come to that aspect, Professor. But let me also get in a perspective from Ambassador Puri on the expansion and the interest of several countries in joining this very exciting group, as you put forth. Ambassador, I came across a very interesting statement also from Dr. S. Jaishankar. He went on to say that BRICS is a statement in itself and can make a real difference. We, in fact, saw that difference this time around in the group picture of the BRICS nations. So an expanded family, an expanded agenda. But the question here is, how symbolic is the expansion? What's the important message about the shifting or the changing global order?
Tina, thank you very much. And let me amplify a little bit from my perspective on what Professor Swan Singh has already mentioned. Look, I don't think this is only symbolic. This is a very important grouping of countries which constitute roughly half the global population, and which contribute as much as 33% of global GDP.
Right.
So, let's not look at this only in that particular sense. It's a grouping of emerging countries who are strongly tied, or in fact are part of the global south, and so therefore bring to the fore the very same ideas which are critically important to the global south. Now, I know this particular fact that, people talk in terms of the juxtaposition vis-a-vis the group of seven, the 7 developed countries of the world and so on, but I don't want to get into that. I don't want to say that this is a juxtaposition. I don't. I want to say this is a grouping of emerging countries who are in a position and who can play and who do play a leadership role of global south and the ideas of the south. India is particularly important because we are a country which is a member of the global south, one of the members of the BRICS. Perhaps today it will be difficult for us to classify them as a member of the global south, I mean China. But the fact is that this is a very important grouping, and that's why its deliberations, its expansion have been of particular interest across the world. Now, in this particular summit, I want to point out a few things. Look, these were countries which were like-minded. So, to have expected a contentious negotiation process for the declaration, that was unlikely, and it didn't. They found via media solutions of most global issues and problems. But they did raise some very interesting things. You recall in 2016, when the BRICS Summit was held in Goa, the new development bank was set up. Well, after nearly 8 years, first in Johannesburg, there was the expansion. That was important, not just symbolic, but brought in other major players in the global south into this particular grouping. The second thing that happened this time was that what people have been talking about, the summit actually gave a certain amount of hint and vent to those particular ideas. Let me take a few minutes about this. The grain bank, a Russian idea, obviously of interest to the Russians, but hugely of interest to the global south. Recall that in the year 2022, African heads of government traveled all the way to Sochi in Russia to ask the Russian president to, be agreeable to a grain deal with Ukraine. That's the kind of importance of it. Then all those financial measures, currency possibilities, currency swaps, ideas of currency balance of payments mechanisms, all of those are important. From my perspective, I think particularly important, highlighting the Indian contribution, is the fact and recognition, like it was done in the G20, of the digital and the entire virtual possibilities in terms of making payments, and the willingness of the BRICS to take all of this forward. I think this was a significant summit. It was a summit which not only enlarged the BRICS and, in that sense, put the imprint of the global south squarely on global governance, but also took meaningful steps in the one area which critically, in my mind, matters, which is the area of the economy, the area of money and finance, and as Professor Saab just mentioned, including areas of sustainability and climate finance.
So in that context, Professor, because it benefits both, it sort of solidifies India's position that we took at G20, giving a voice to the Global South. And now we've seen an expansive agenda which is going to benefit countries of the Global South. But also the fact that do you now see this evolution, the expansion of BRICS from a geo-economic framework to a more geopolitical one in the current geopolitical scenario? And what are going to be some of the geopolitical implications also of this expansive group?
And that's true that as it has expanded and has become more attractive, it's no longer simply confining agenda to only pure monetary and financial issues.
Absolutely.
It does step out and talk about other major concerns that the stakeholders, the members, partners and aspirants have in terms of what they think BRICS should be delivering. So fundamental point that brings all of these nations together is their shared understanding that the Bretton Woods institutions of post-World War II are no longer representative of the reality that we live in today. Okay. And perhaps there is need for recasting those organizations so that the current really major players are represented in those. For instance, IMF is always headed by a European, and World Bank is always headed by an American citizen. Whereas the world has moved in a very different direction, whereas Ambassador just mentioned, BRICS collective GDP is far larger today than G7 countries collectively. And of course, in population terms, they are really much larger compared to G7, which continues to largely control global governance from that perspective. So therefore, I think the BRICS nations are bringing a whole new way of thinking, and that is why, you know, it's a statement, as you quoted the foreign minister saying. So the kind of more equitable and more inclusive approach that BRICS is taking is what makes BRICS also increasingly effective. And for example, they are, you know, about 40% of global oil exports are now within BRICS. Number one and number two importers, largest importers of oil are within BRICS. And therefore, you know, China is now world's largest donor from 2017. India is world's largest, fastest growing economy and going to be third largest economy. So a lot of momentum here is what is bringing them together. But yes, your question is they are moving into political geopolitics as well. And that is particularly driven by the paranoia that we notice in Western world about what BRICS is going to do. They look at their efforts to use increasingly local currencies. They interpret it in terms of de-dollarization. It's not an attempt to finish dollar as a
finding alternate means.
It's finding alternatives. Euro was another effort made earlier. So in that sense, the paranoia that West sees from BRICS makes every statement of BRICS, you know, being seen from prism of geopolitics, and that would perhaps make consensus increasingly difficult as now members moved from 5 to 9. There are a lot of other, you know,
in
the waiting now. So as the grouping expands, this externally driven geopolitical perceptions of members perhaps will make the consensus increasingly a challenging task for the next host, Brazil, for example. This will be an increasing challenge, how to ensure that consensus. But the fact that they stood together, they've issued a great statement, is important for the G20 meeting now, which is where Global South is being connected by India's initiative last year. And interesting it is to see Russia, China, India, all of us see as important members, in fact, leaders of Global South. And the body language in Kazan was very interesting of these three leaders to see there is a certain increasing bonhomie, if not camaraderie, which should see them also coordinating their strategies as to how they wish to bring Global South to the center stage of global decision making.
Okay, Ambassador, since we're talking about, you know, the fact that how there's been a shift from just being a geo-economic framework to a more geopolitical one, and quite interestingly, there are more and more members who are part of NATO, who are closer to the Western nations, but they also want a say in the BRICS. So very interesting analysis. Your perspective on, do you see this this influence now being exerted from in terms of shaping not just the global economic system, we are talking about the local currencies, we are talking about sharing of the best practices in which India's digital payment system comes in, but also in terms of influence in dealing with conflicts that are taking place in different parts of the world, in a more enhanced efforts towards, say, sustainable development, climate change, issues of counter-terrorism, etc.?
Tina, absolutely. Look, you can almost not divorce geopolitics from anything else. After all, let's be very clear, money is the other facet of power.
Absolutely.
So, let's be very clear about that. Where there is such large amounts of money, there will be politics. And that's very rightly said. Now, coming to what this grouping will be able to do, I must point out to you that 5th of November is just around the corner. And that perhaps is the most important thing which is weighing on the minds of most global leaders, because the largest player in the world, without doubt, no matter what we talk about their decline, etc., they are the most influential. I mean, the United States, which direction it will go will get determined then. And I think lots of things that have happened are predicated as a result of, I wouldn't say people taking steps, but perhaps hedging bets. That's important. I don't think we should hedge away from that particular part. What can the BRICS do? There should be no doubt in anyone's mind that this grouping coming together harmonizes the position of larger developing countries and speaking for the global south. You saw this at the G20 summit in Delhi. Because all these emerging countries took a particular stance, you could say that the group of 7 also had to look the other way, let's say on a matter of critical domestic interest to them, the Ukraine issue, etc., and allow a declaration which married various viewpoints and allowed things to go forward. Now, the importance of the BRICS, therefore, just cannot be understated anymore. They are also together harmoniously, and their voices would tend to get coordinated automatically as a result of the process over so many years. You will see this at the World Bank, at the IMF, at the G20. You'll see it lots of places. But let me leave a slight word of caution, because it's a little important to address all of this. As the larger countries in the global south come together in this kind of a grouping which was small to start with, 5 countries, and now rapidly expanded. If you take 10, 15 more, then all the large players of the global south will be on one side. Then remember, big challenge to you will be, of course, on the one side, the large developed economies, OECD, G7, or whatever you want to call them. And the other will be all the small players in the world. Right. Because no matter what you say, that you stand for them, they'll say, well, you stand for yourself. They stand for themselves. Who stands for us? So it is a matter which needs to be thought through, because it's all very well to say that I stand for you, but you are not here. It's me who is speaking. So this is an interesting element, but without doubt, the BRICS will be an important element in global decision making. Of that we should have no doubt. And India's role, I think, is self-evident.
Okay, but that question, Professor, leads me also to the challenges that you rightly pointed out in the earlier remark was, when you don't have a defined charter or a secretariat or no common funds as well, but you have an expanded outreach, expanded agenda as mentioned in the Kazan declaration, do you think when the bloc will largely rely on consensus-based decision-making, and which is very informal, that is also a very big challenge in the times to come, because you have countries that that also are dealing with lots of internal conflicts, and the 2 big large economies being India and China?
That's absolutely right, Tina. Let me begin by saying that organizations with a secretariat, with a strict membership, with a charter or constitution is a 20th century phenomenon. In 21st century, we are largely talking of groupings and networks. You must have heard Dr. Jaishankar often mentions of plurilateralism, which is basically emphasizing on fluidity and flexibility of groupings. And consensus is important, and consensus will have its own challenges to build. But if you notice various speeches made in Kazan, and there is an effort also to make a distinction between the founding members who have just joined, and the partner nations. So I think that, if not directly, that distinction will stay on also in terms of how consensus is built. So initially the consensus has to be built between the core members, and then of course others will join over a period of time. That distinction is beginning to be seen now within BRICS nations. So Russia, China, India would definitely be very, very critical to how BRICS moves forward in coming times. Now, as far as the challenges are concerned, I am more concerned with the expanding agenda that they have. And since they are expanding their agenda, so will the challenges will expand, because
Certainly.
as you mentioned, there is no dedicated source of funding as of now available to push forward some of these initiatives. But at the same time, these are all in their own way rapidly growing economies. So their economic heft is going to constantly increase over a period of time. Growth rates, even in smaller economies of BRICS today, are relatively impressive compared to growth rates in advanced countries, which is where United States for a long time was stuck on about 1.8%, now moving beyond 2 and reaching almost 3%. So in that sense, the confidence of these BRICS nations would perhaps help them to constantly move forward in dealing with the challenges that they've laid for themselves. Major issues they are talking is of reforming international institutions. And that is no longer being said in terms of myopic self-interest of what India will get, what China will get, what Russia will get. I think it's a larger motive of making these institutions more representative of the world we live in, and therefore making them more effective. We have seen United Nations, almost dysfunctional in case of both conflict in West Asia and conflict in Ukraine and Russia. So in that sense, the focus is, particularly India's focus is to make sure that we are not ignoring and undermining certain institutions that exist. That is why, again, Foreign Minister repeatedly says BRICS is non-Western but not anti-Western. And India stands for that, that we want to make sure that certain bridge building can be done between East and West, North and South. Institutions can be gradually, incrementally improvised instead of junking them away as irrelevant and creating parallel institutions. That is the fear that West has, that BRICS is beginning to appear as an alternative, which is how many countries of Global South see it. So some of these disjunctions have to be smoothened, and an expanding agenda has to be really carried forward. Those are the challenges that BRICS today face, but I'm sure they are strategizing as to how they will deal with those challenges, constantly going through consensus building, which is where I personally notice as one person that perhaps now the founding members and additional members and partner nations, there is going to be certain calibration of how consensus has to move from the center to the periphery in that sense.
Absolutely. We'll hope in the times to come the declaration, the points that have been mentioned will translate into significant outcomes which will benefit India and the region at large. But Ambassador Puri, the other big takeaway of Prime Minister's visit to Russia has been the key bilateral, which we were all looking forward to and which ultimately happened after nearly a gap of 5 years. The important bilateral meeting between the Chinese President and the Prime Minister. What do you make of this meeting? Although we've seen the MEA statement quite, calculative in the kind of words that have been used, but about the existing tensions which prevailed at the border since 2020, and now the relations between India and China, we are seeing a thaw, but how do we look at a future of India-China ties, which are more progressive and which are based on mutual trust? That's the key word.
Tina, thank you very much. Let me quote to you the Chief of Army Staff, who spoke just the day after the Foreign Secretary announced this disengagement agreement. And he quoted Ronald Reagan in the famous thing, trust but verify. So much of this will have to be seen, how it translates. We've done this in the past, not once with the Honorable Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, but earlier also wanting to go ahead, extending a hand of friendship, but then things went awry. And that particular longer term challenge, I don't think is so very easy to get. Now, the meeting was predicated, certainly, and let me say in some senses it got arranged because the two sides came together on an agreement on this disengagement at the borders, which was really the big, huge sticking point. That allowed the meeting to happen. Both sides stressed the importance of maintaining border tranquility, peace, and so on and so forth. But the proof of the pudding will lie in the eating. And as far as we are concerned, we've had a case of at least once bitten and you would be twice shy on that entire matter. That's important. Why did all this come about? Look, all of us in this field would have our own ideas, various things, but I would take you always back to the 5th of November business, And I think the Chinese also see some elements of writings in their own way and think that it's important that they are not in a situation of, let me say, confrontation as far as India is concerned, that would free them and help them a little bit in the larger looming thing, which is bound to be a challenge as far as they are concerned. So, opportunity, certainly. Let me make another point to you on this China business. You know, in India, while the geopolitical strategists, foreign affairs specialists, defense specialists, etc., have a certain view, the people in the economy, business people, etc., they were saying repeatedly, and you would have read about it in the newspapers, that look, it is true that we have an issue with China. We should shorten our supply chains. We should be more mindful of how we deal with the Chinese imports, exports, as well as financial flows from the Chinese. But we need them. And that was also a pressure which I don't think we should underestimate, but which is important for us to grow the economy. Ultimately, a grown economy of India, not just third largest, but a shrinking of the differential with China, is what is going to be important in terms of this power play between these two great nations of Asia, to which I think there is an inevitability.
Okay, Professor, the fact that, you know, India-China relations, and if they're on a stronger footing, they mutually benefit both countries and the region as well. This we've heard umpteen number of times from leaders of both sides, but on the ground, and especially after 2020, we've seen how relations hit a new low. The fact that the current thaw offers some hope in improvement in ties, but what would it require on part of China particularly? We've seen it's one neighbor that can't be trusted. For lasting peace at the borders and for our relations to move further on a positive side, what will it take?
I think peace will be always work in the making. It's not that we can at any stage relax and say now things are done. But the fact that after a long wait of 4 years, now we have a message from the highest level, from the national leaders of both countries, saying that we want to now climb down from the tension point. So in that sense, it's a good signal. Of course, a lot of work remains to be done. Good side is that they have agreed on the patrolling and grazing arrangements, which often is the reason why tensions are built up. Mm-hmm. But they have to now do other things like, sort of drawing back their armed forces from advanced positions in the frontier, then move to de-escalation, then, come back to peace and tranquility kind of mode that we have had before. Then at some stage start talking of resolving this world's longest disputed boundary between any two nations. Of course, these are also very powerful and rapidly transforming countries. So the confidence of armed forces and common citizens, the facilities on the frontiers are transforming as well, which make the mobility very easy. So you can bring in larger numbers with heavier equipment, quasi-permanent structures, much faster to the front, and that is going to be constantly adding on to the frequency and intensity of what we call aggressions, which we have to manage much better. So because they also have past, which is the question is, can we trust them? We also have future, where these expanding economies are also transacting business with each other, which is creating new challenges. If you don't have any trade, no irritants. But when you have huge amount of trade of $138 billion, 500,000 people traveling from one side to the other, then there are issues of visa, there are issues of all kinds of new issues for the future. And of course, they collectively want to work together to deal with many global and regional challenges, where even if their aim and objective is similar, their strategies are often at variance. So there are going to be a lot of challenges to still follow from here, but it's a great signal that two leaders are indicating that we want to now ensure that we return back to peace and tranquility and find a solution between us, that we want to work together and resolve issues that we have had and, actually complement each other's development trajectories in that sense. So it's a good signal, and potentially how we move forward from here can make it a, really inflection point between the relations of China and India. But I think it's also a very quick point I want to make here, and I saw Ambassador making mention of domestic compulsions from Indian side. India has proven to be unique neighbor of China. China's strategy of 2 steps forward, 1 step backward has been very effective in South China Sea. ASEAN nations till date have not stood up to China despite their claims and counterclaims there. India stood up for 4.5 years on the border, and not only the 2 steps forward, 1 step backward failed, when China tried to improvise strategy and say, let us look at the staying power and who blinks first. India refused to blink. And therefore, I think that compelled China to move to peacemaking with India, and that's a great lesson for Chinese, and I think also lesson for India in that sense that India cannot be a country like any other.
Right.
In fact, let me also add, by the body language that I noticed, how Prime Minister Modi walked in and Xi Jinping looked like hosting that meeting of two leaders. It makes me feel that meeting was solicited by Chinese and not by Indian side.
Oh, so on that note, we'll have to wind up the program. That's an interesting takeaway. So we'll have to see how the India-China relations build up in future. For now, of course, the reality is that the talks at the diplomatic and the military level are going to continue for peace to prevail at the borders. It will be difficult for relations to get back to the level at which they were before the Galwan incident happened in 2020. But of course, in the better interest of both India and China, and as our leaders keep reiterating, for the two large economies to have better relations is something that is going to be mutually beneficial for the region as well, and for the larger global good as well. So we'll see how that relation transforms for the good in the times to come. But with that, I'll wrap up the conversation because time allows me to take up only that much on this edition of Perspective. Thank you, Professor and Ambassador, for joining us on this broadcast, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. And to your viewers, thank you very much for your time as well.
संसद टीवी के और भी प्रोग्राम्स देखने के लिए सब्सक्राइब करें हमारा YouTube चैनल और हाँ, इन्हें लाइक और शेयर करना ना भूलें।